What's up? It's Guru Jojo, and this video is an astropsychology course segment, however you want to perceive it, but it's astropsychology. So, in the last video, which was, I believe, the moon and the emotional bodies that I did in astropsychology, we spoke about how the moon is pretty much connected to the regulation of our emotions and feelings, and how this reflects in our personality and our behavior. And I basically describe the the emotional expression, the personalities of people that are basically constructed under what society would consider to be normal behavior, or yeah, pretty much normal behavior. And then there's a book, right? The DSM, or the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. If I'm incorrect, I will fix that on the screen, but I'm pretty sure that is what it's called. And it's basically a manual that describes the different symptoms, right, of personality, and how that correlates to specific diseases like mental health problems. And there's so many. There's so many. But in this particular video, we're doing mood disorders. Okay, mood disorders have to do with some sort of fluctuation that would be considered extreme, and it breaks out of what society would consider to be normal behavior. Okay, so keep in mind that this actually varies depending on where you live. If you live in a country outside of, the United States of America, talking to yourself is actually deemed to be a normal behavior. Whereas here, we look at people talking to themselves as being ill or sick. But that's just because of the way that our society was structured. Um, and because, you know, I actually wonder. I hate to disrupt this like this course like this, but I'm a critical thinker. I'm a critical thinker. So my thing is, what why doesn't other countries view talking to yourself as not normal? Because here's my thing. I talk to myself all the time, especially if I'm like home by myself. I think everyone does, but it starts to get weird when people do it in public, and if it's quite loud, and then that's when it's disruptive. So this is why I talk things out, because now I just answered my question. It's when things become disruptive and it starts to interfere with other people's day-to-day task. That's when it becomes suspicious. But the problem with our society is that we tend to look at things on a more we look at small details and we tend to exaggerate them. So talking to yourself is completely normal, but when someone's like yelling, in CVS to themselves, like no one else is around, that's when it's like raises a red flag. But for some reason, our society, we tend to look at like everything wrong with everyone, and it could just be like a minor detail that we tend to over exaggerate based upon like our own personal opinions. But that's besides the point. It's just I wanted to add that factor in, because depending on where you live, it really does determine whether something is this or that, or that or this. So, mood disorders. All right. A mood disorder is basically something that causes a disturbance to the emotions and feelings, the temperament of a person. So, alchemically speaking, we know that there's different alchemical elements: fire, earth, air, and water. Now, the element that deals the most with emotion, like feelings, is the water element, because the water element is constantly flowing, right? So, this is what's determining our emotions and feelings. Like, how is our waters flowing at the time, right? And then what happens is, if there's a disruption, then these waters become too out of whack, or they become stagnant and they're not flowing so much. That's pretty much when stuff gets disturbed. And this could be causal of some sort of imbalance as it relates to the other alchemical elements. So, for example, you can have too much fire, right? And too much fire with water is pretty much just going to cause there to be a lack of water. And when there's a lack of water, then this causes too much friction. And then this causes like maybe a person to maybe be out of balance with their actual persona. So that's when we're going to jump more into personality disorders and stuff. But even for mood disorders, this is where we can start to jump into things like bipolar, and having manic episodes, kind of like dissociating temporarily from the self and thinking of the self in a heightened state, to the point that we may overspend, or we may become overly sexual, or we may become overly just dramatic in general during a manic episode. But let's go over the three main mood disorders, right? You're going to have depression, then you have your manic depression, or you can call it bipolar, and then you have your anxiety. Now, what's interesting about this is that these three that I mentioned, okay, they generally all come together, and they call this comorbid, basically. And it basically means that they generally happen concurrently. Think about it. If somebody has depression, right, this means that they go into a state of restriction, limitation. Naturally, their brain basically creates some sort of neural pathways that become structured over time to make them feel this way. And then this is what creates depression. So then, if the body's constantly trying to maintain homeostasis, what's going to occur is we're going to end up feeling like out of nowhere heightened. And so that's why a lot of times people that get depressed can have mixed episodes, meaning that they could be depressed and also in a heightened state at the same time. And this is like mixed mania. A lot of times our body's trying to rebalance itself, so to maintain that homeostasis. So naturally, if we stay in a state of depression for such a long time, there may be sudden sparks of inspiration that create mania in order just to like balance out the energies of like being depressed for so long. Like the brain just may suddenly just get a trigger that snaps the person out of their controlled state. Also too, this would occur because if somebody's depressed for so long all the time, they may partake in behaviors that bring them temporarily out of it. It's common for people with depression to do such things like drink or take some sort of drugs, which outside of prescription I'm speaking of. So not like a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, which is a common medication for people who have depression, or SSRI, but I'm speaking on like self-medicating type stuff. And then this would also cause a fluctuation in the way that the brain's neurotransmitters are functioning. It could cause the person to jump out of that depressed state and go into mania. So that's why you see how depression and bipolar work hand in hand. And this fluctuation can cause the nervous system to come out of balance, which can create anxiety, which is the third type of mood disorder that I mentioned. At the same time, you can think of it backwards as people that have anxiety, they get scared to be socially interactive, right? They could become afraid to act upon certain things, and this would leave them into a depressed state. And then those times where they're finally able to detach from those states of depression, they may jump straight into mania. So you see how these all kind of can impact one another. It's like literally, In my opinion, I think that most people that get depression, I feel like it often starts with anxiety, but that's just my personal opinion. I have no facts to back that up. But with that being said, I want to jump into how the alchemical elements lead to these imbalances. Is your main two elements of emotional expression is going to be your water and your fire element, asserting the self, and also in the nurturance of the self. Asserting, fire, nurturance, water. Then you have your air and your earth elements. These are connected more so to the way that we make our emotions and feelings practical, because water and fire aren't practical energies. They're very emotionally based. And when things are emotionally based, it just causes us to do whatever without considering security, stability, or responsibility. The earth and the air element is more connected to logic and reasoning and practicality. So your air element is, it likes to make sense of the emotions and feelings, where the earth element, it takes that sensibility and now it puts it into a secure state. So then the three mood disorders, depression, bipolar, and anxiety, these are generally caused by confusion. So anytime that someone is put into a state of confusion for a long period of time, it generally leads to depression and anxiety, which could then lead to bipolar. Depression and anxiety, which then could lead to bipolar, basically. So what happens is people that stay in a state of confusion for a long time, they generally will try to escape that by making something up, if that makes sense. So what happens is, it's like the brain begins to make up the picture that is not being seen. So when you understand stuff, you could see the picture. We could see the lines. We could see the, so we see the structure, and then it's colored in, so we could see the colors. And we could see the full image. But when somebody's confused, the lines are blurred. It's like nobody drew in any type of structured lines. It's all over the place. It's messy. It's smudgy. It's halfway colored in. So what happens is the brain naturally says, let me just make something up. Okay, now this is good for creativity and art and whatnot, but it's not good for everyday life. So what happens is, since we live in everyday life, right, we're here on earth and we have to live like a regular everyday life. When you jump out from being creative and having fun or whatever, this is where you have now boundaries, restrictions, and limitations. So what happens is that the energy becomes basically like restricted, if that makes sense. When somebody's in a state of constant confusion, they feel restricted from they feel restricted from appreciating life, appreciating reality. Because by default, if you're constantly making up stories in your head because you're confused, then that means that your energy only feels happy, or a sense of relief, or a sense of pleasure, when it's in a state of its imagination. And then when it's not able to come out of that state of imagination, or when it's forced to come out of that state of imagination, the person feels depressed. But the main thing, what I'm telling you is, like, depression is generally caused by not knowing, being confused. And then from being confused, the person faces boundaries, restrictions, and limits on reality. Like, so it's hard for them to actually feel comfortable with reality. And then that's what causes depression. So anytime a person is unable to be logical and practical for a long period of time, or if this is like a reoccurring theme in their lives, this is what causes, generally speaking, your your mood disorders, and then this develops into, which I'm going to speak about in a later video, your your more harsh or extreme mental disorders like schizophrenia and stuff. But in general, depression is caused by a lack of not knowing. Whenever somebody's put into a state of not knowing, which develops into confusion, they then are unable to process information in a logical way. And then this also causes a disruption on their ability to be practical on a day-to-day basis, because you don't understand what's going on. It's kind of hard to actually be responsible. It becomes difficult to actually create stability in your life because your mind starts to get disruptive. That's the reason why too things like schizophrenia and whatnot, and being psychotic, it doesn't develop until later in age. Like people, you don't. Most now, there is some cases where I've seen like a documentary a while back where there was a kid that had an early onset of schizophrenia, but in general, things like schizophrenia happens like after age 25 or something like that, or 23. I don't know the exact age, but it's like your young adult years is when that develops. And then when you get into things like anxiety is basically feeling overwhelmed. So a lot of times people who have anxiety, they're constantly overthinking things like, should I do this, should I wear that, what time should I do this, oh my gosh, I'm gonna be late, or oh my gosh, I'm gonna be too early, or oh my gosh, they're constantly worried about the things that could go wrong, to the point that this causes inaction. The brain now is documenting that pattern of thought, that pattern of behavior, as a learned helplessness. So then the person is constantly being inactive. The brain naturally starts to become that. It becomes inactive. So then that's where anxiety and depression crosses, because it's just like, the person could become, it's like the person could just sit there and be so overwhelmed in their thoughts that they create limitations for themselves, and then they just become very, very, very like cognitive, and they're constantly just thinking about things that they may do or things that they want to do, but they never actually do them. That's like a very anxious person. And then, there's different types of disorders that are sub disorders of those three mood disorders. So, like I was saying, under depression, you have your, I think depression one. No, you have basically, I forgot what they're exactly called, but you have your long term depression, and then you have like your short term depression. Like everyone pretty much goes through this short term depression. Then you also have your seasonal affective disorder, which is a type of depression that only occurs at a particular season. So a lot of people may have like the winter blues or something like that, because the sun goes the sun sets more quickly, it's cold outside, you're not really getting enough light, you know what I'm saying? So then you might have to get one of them light thingies. There's a light you can actually buy for depression. Then you have bipolar 1 and 2. Bipolar 1 is a major depressive episode, I believe, with a hypermania. So usually these people could be depressed for like the majority of the year, and then they'll have like one or two full-blown manic episodes. Now the manic episodes are always shorter. This is goes to show you that the while the brain is in a state of depression, it's holding on to all of the chemicals that have to do with the other extreme of excitation and whatnot, right? So then that's where the hypomania pops in randomly. And then you have your bipolar 2, which I believe is just like a little bit of a lighter form. The only difference is that it's a hypomania, so the mania is a little lighter. It's not as extreme this as far as the symptoms go. And then you have your mixed mania, which is basically people that could be depressed and manic at the same time. It's basically just like people that have more quick fluctuations. You know, they could be depressed for like 3 days, and then maybe for 2 days out of the week they're manic, and then next week they're just completely depressed, and then they're completely depressed again for another week, and then suddenly the next week they're in mania again. But it's usually hypomania and it's usually hypodepression. So the depression is a little bit lighter, and then the manic symptoms are a little bit lighter as well. Then you have anxiety, and then under anxiety there's like social anxiety, there's agoraphobia. So social anxiety is going to be where somebody's anxious about having social situations. So when it comes to just like socializing and whatnot, they may just feel like they may overthink it to the point that they don't even want to do it. And then agoraphobia makes you fearful of actually leaving your home because there's like a fear of possibly embarrassing the self outside of the home, like having a panic attack and everybody seeing it, or maybe doing something, and just doing something embarrassing and just it being publicly seen. So then the person has a fear of actually leaving the comfort of their home. That's agoraphobia. What else? There's generalized anxiety disorder, and then there's like social, and then I think you could say panic disorder could come under there too, and that's when a person has panic attacks. Also, stuff like PTSD, a person experienced a traumatic event, and now this is disrupting their thoughts. Again, the thoughts. Once the mental becomes disrupted, it creates confusion, boundaries, restrictions, and limitations. And then this is the beginning of mood disorders, pretty much. And as long as that carries on, it continues to create confusion. It continues to create boundaries, restrictions, and limitations in the person's ability to be practical, and to be rational. So any disruption in the air element of mental processing and the earth element of being practical is what ultimately leads to some sort of imbalance or extreme fluctuation in a person's mood, which could create mood disorders as well as leading on to mental health disorders and stuff like being psychotic and having schizophrenia. And those I'm going to speak about, as I stated earlier in the video, in the next Astropsychology video course. Like, share, subscribe if you enjoyed the video, or at least like if you enjoyed the video, so I know whether to continue to do it or not. If people don't like it or comment, then I kind of just feel like, okay, people are not interested. So yeah, and if all goes well, the next video will be on your mental health disorders, and I'll probably do personality disorders eventually and get into things like that. So thank you for watching. Blessings, light, and love.